Hi everyone, it's Diane with Batik, and today we are going to make a dress. The dress we are making today is the New Look 6340. And I think on one of our Fabric Friday videos, I did introduce this dress. It was first made using our Batik linen, and this is the Medora Flora motif in the shade of Copen Blue. We made version A, which is the simple sleeveless dress with front pockets, as well as we incorporated the side pockets into it. The other views on this pattern have side pockets, but since there was front pockets on view A, you were supposed to put the side pockets in as well, but I really like using a side pocket when I'm putting a phone or carrying a phone with me, and I just didn't want anything to weigh down the front of the dress. And so we did that. We did that little adjustment to the pattern itself. But the garment I'm going to show today in our garment construction is the Gradation Rayon dress. And this is our new fabric collection. We are introducing, I don't remember how many different fabrics. I think it's around 10 or so different shades of our nuance gradation. And much like our cotton gradations, they're the same dyeing technique, a hand-dyed technique for incorporating multiple shades of depth of a color across the width of the fabric. And so the gradation fabric that I started with is Copen Blue, and here's a sample of it if I were to hold it out with selvage here and a selvage here. So it is light on one selvage, transitioning to the darkest shade here on the other selvage. So when I cut this fabric out to make this dress, I really wanted to feature the change in color. And so we laid out the pattern from selvage to selvage this direction, okay? So today I'm going to take you through the process of laying out the pattern pieces and the general construction of how I went about making this garment. And I did not incorporate the pockets in the rayon version of this dress. So those pieces of the garment construction are not included in this video, but they're super easy and they're super simple to follow. I will make note of them as I go along in constructing the garment itself, but I did not incorporate them. I just wanted a simple rayon drapey fun dress because I wasn't thinking I would put a phone or anything in a pocket on the side seam anyway. I just decided to kind of let it be without any pockets, okay? A little bit about the pattern. Let's start there. The pattern itself it's a New Look pattern. So if you're familiar with New Look patterns, very well written, no mistakes. It's a simple pattern that has 5/8 inch seam allowances. The size range is from an 8 to a 20. And the garment size that I made here is a straight 14. Both of these garments were made with a size 14. I used 3 yards, just slightly less than 3 yards of fabric for the gradation version of this. And I would have to go back to my notes to know how many yards we used for the linen, but it is a wider fabric. This is 54 inches wide. So my guess is we did not use any more than the 3 yards that we used here for the Gradation Rayon version. You will need about 1/4 yard of 20-inch wide interfacing. And I want to talk a little bit about the interfacing before we get over to the actual construction. I typically recommend that we use Envy Silk, which is a super lightweight interfacing. I mean, it's very sheer. It's just really, really sheer for any of the construction when we're working with rayon. However, my exception is always in the collar or neckline area. for one reason. Right in here, when there's a design element that is a point or a neckline that doesn't have a collar or a stand-up collar, it needs a little bit of extra stability. Otherwise, I wish I had a garment in here that was doing this, but otherwise that V will flop. It'll flop forward on you because it doesn't have enough structure to it. So I incorporated Pellon's SF101, which is a stiffer interfacing into this. It's like a woven interfacing, so it doesn't have any of the little dots on it for the adhesive. I didn't want anything that looked like it was going to transfer to the outside of this fabric. So SF101 is what I used to give it a little extra stability. And I think that's what we used in the linen version as well, to give it that extra stand up. I wanted it to always have that V in the front without flopping over. Okay, but that was the only other change that I would say that we did to this garment. I used an 80-12 needle, and I used So Fine thread, which is a polyester thread. I did use a serger for finishing off the seams and for any edge stitching, such as the hem and the edge around the facing itself. I did use a serger, and my sewing machine for some of the construction, not all of it. So other than that, I used, of course, you're going to need your iron, your ironing board, a marking pencil. I use a marking pencil as well as a wheel chalk pencil, and a hot hemmer for hemming the hem of your garment. Otherwise, I don't think I used anything except for a seam ripper now and again. I did. So let's get started. First, I'm going to show you how we laid out the pattern on the fabric itself. I've laid out the fabric on my cutting table, and you'll see to the left, that is the pattern piece for the front of the dress. Nothing needs to be on a fold here because the back and the front both have seams. So what I like to do is I like to measure the pattern piece and then position the fabric with that measurement. And so that's what you saw me doing there when I was measuring the fabric. I measured the cut edge to the fold. And now positioning the pattern piece on the fabric where the shoulder is nearly touching the selvage edge with the lightest side of the Copen blue. And the hem is going to run along the other selvage edge, which is the darkest shade. And I pin everything along the grain line. I start with one pin, and then I take a tape measure and I measure that pin to the fold, which is where my right hand is sitting, is on that fold. And then I adjust the pattern, moving it left or right to make sure that the measurement between the grain line on the pattern piece and the fold is in alignment. And I just always want to make sure that that grain line, since I'm not working with a selvage edge here, I want to make sure that that grain line is still straight on the front piece. I'm going to do the same exact steps for the back two pieces of the garment. And then the only other pieces we have to cut out for this dress are the front and back facing and the bias strip that I'm going to use for finishing up the sleeve opening, the arm opening. I do need a bias strip of fabric for that. Since I decided not to make pockets and add pockets to this dress, I don't have to do any of that. But if you want to add side pockets or front pockets, you will need fabric for that as well. And so with a gradation, you could position your fabric anywhere you want to make that pocket either stand out or just sort of melt into the fabric color itself. So I'm going to continue pinning and cutting out the front pattern pieces, the back, the two neck facings, and the bias strip and we'll get started with construction. Before we move our pattern piece with the fabric that we've just cut, we need to mark all of the lines. And this is the front pattern piece. And so what I do, and we probably each have our own preferences, but I take a snip with my scissor into each one of the marking points. I know when I was a kid and learned how to sew, or started my sewing process, I always cut out and followed those markings so that I always knew where those markings were. Whatever your preference is, either snip into the fabric or follow the little marking points and make sure that you have all of those marked. Next, what I do is I take my pencil or roller chalk, and since this is the front pattern piece, I want to make sure that I have all of the dots marked and I have the dart marked properly. And so what I do, and I think for this particular pattern layout, I have the wrong side of the fabric out. So it's folded with the right side inside, which makes it a lot easier for me to mark my pattern. I can simply lift up the pattern piece, put a pin in the marking, and right at the neckline here, we need to mark 2 different points. One at the center point where the V connects, and one up at the neckline where it just takes its turn from the V point up towards the round of the neck. Now I'm marking the dart. And so what I do is I'll mark the ending point of that dart. I put a pin in the fabric, turn the fabric over, and then use my marking pencil to mark exactly where that pin is. So I have both sides of my front piece marked. And then what I do is I'll fold back the pattern piece, and I do use a very small ruler, like a straight edge, and the rolling chalk that I have, the chalk, what's the name of that chalk? Anyway, it's the chalk with the roller on it, to follow right along the edge of the line for the dart. See, here's my ruler, and I just want to make sure that that is a perfectly straight dart line. So I fold back my pattern piece on top of the ruler, and this is the Chocoliner chalk, which has the roller on the top of it. And when you're working with rayon, using a roller-based chalk versus a pencil is really a good idea, simply because the flimsiness, and if I could say it that way, of a rayon, it's not like putting a pencil, a lead pencil or a chalk pencil on a cotton. It's going to stay in place. The cotton is not going to move. With a rayon, it does move slightly. And so I found that always having the chalk on a roller. Now, you may also have the chalk sheets, the transfer sheets, plus a roller tool. That works well as well. I just always want to make sure that I'm using something that has a roller on it. It just makes it so much easier to do the chalk outline. So I'm going to finish on the back side, or the wrong side, of the second front piece using the same technique. And right here I have the roller in my hand, and that is just, it's so simple to follow the end point of the dart and the center point of the dart to make sure that everything is transferred properly. I follow the same process for any of the markings on the back 2 pattern pieces, as well as the 2 facing pieces. And the only thing that I do on the binding, the bias binding piece, is to make sure that I know where the center of my bias is, because I want to make sure that I'm putting that on the center shoulder as I put the bias on my garment. But we'll get to that in a future step. The garment pieces are now cut out, and I have traced all of the different markings on each one of the pieces. The first step of sewing pretty much any garment is to stay stitch the neckline, sewing from the shoulder into the center of the front and the back. I'm going to finish off the darts on the front, and then I'm going to jump over to the serger, and I'm going to finish off every single one of the outside edges. I'm going to use my sewing machine to stitch up the garment, but I really want to finish the edges of each one of the pattern pieces before I stitch this together. Use a zigzag stitch or an overlock stitch if you're working without a serger. I have my serger set to a 4-thread overlock, and I'm going to seal the edges of the front of the garment, the center seam. And the other front. Now, one thing that I have is I have the knife engaged, and I'm just following along the very edge of the center, what's going to be the center seam of the front of the garment. And one thing to remember too is I'm always serging on the right side of the fabric when I'm finishing the seam. Next, we're going to put the seam in the center back, using the serger from top to hem. I've pinned the front to the back at the shoulder seams, and now I'm going to use the serger to simply finish it off. You could use your sewing machine if you'd like, because it will be inside the facing. I just really love to seal the edges to make sure that everything is not going to ravel or anything like that. I'm going to set this aside for a moment, and we're going to work on the facing for the front and the back of the neckline. And what I've done so far is the front of the neckline, what I've done is stitched using the sewing machine over here up from the bottom of the front two facings to the center dot. This is going to be the place where we see the V in the front of the garment. And next, I'm going to finish off the shoulder seams of the facing just like I did the garment. And then we're going to finish the outside edge. Now, the outside edge, you could finish any way that you'd like. If you'd like to turn it and seal the edges and top stitch, that's fine as well. I like to simply use my serger to finish off the edge. Next, we'll finish all the way around the outside edge of the facing. And I'm just engaging it enough to just cut off the very edge to make sure everything is very even. It's time to attach the neck facing to our garment, and we're going to start at the large dot, stitch following that angled line, and then all the way around the outside of the neck and return to the front and stitch straight down to the large dot. Now, before doing any clipping, let's take a look at how this looks. Turning this inside, put the facing inside just to make sure that the front looks okay. And let's see how we have this. And I know we're going to understitch and then trim this back, but I just want to make sure before I go any further that the basics of the V look good. And they do. So that's going to look really, really nice. And everything matched beautifully right in the V. So I'm going to go back and continue following the instructions to trim this back, clip our curves, and then we're going to understitch to keep the wrong side and to keep the inside here, the facing, inside. So understitching is a very important part of making sure that the neckline will sit properly. I'm positioning my needle close to the seam line and just past the point on the left side of the V in the front of the garment, and just stitch maybe 1/8 of an inch away from your seam line. Our goal is just to keep the seam allowance portion of our facing inside the facing and around to the underside of the garment when we wear it. Now we're approaching the other point, on the other side of the front facing. So go really slowly and just get as close as you possibly can to that point and then backstitch. And remember not to stretch the fabric in any way. And turn your garment and make sure that everything looks lined up before clipping anything. There, it looks really, really good here. I'm gonna check the other front and all the way around too. Just make sure that you don't have any places where we missed, or there's a gather or a tuck, because you always have the opportunity to fix that before you continue. There we go. Right there. Very nice. Now let's go back and trim the facing seam allowance as close as possible to the understitching. And we'll press the facing towards the garment, and then at the shoulder seams, once you're done with your garment, put it on, make sure everything feels good, and then simply either stitch in the ditch across your shoulder seam here to secure the facing in place, or hand stitch right along the edge here to make sure that you've tacked down your facing. The back of the dress includes a tie. And so what we need to do next, before we stitch up our side seams, is to sew the ties. We're going to sew a 3/8 of an inch seam, leaving one edge where the dots are on the pattern open so that we can turn the tie right side out. After finishing the side seam and securing the one short end of the tube, what we want to do is trim all the threads and then find your favorite tube turning system. There are so many different ways to turn a very narrow tube right side out. And I clip the ends. I just trim off those corners of the sealed edge and make that seam just a little bit narrower to make it easier to create a really nice finished point, because the end of this tie is a slight point to it. And once it's turned, press it, and we'll be ready to add to the side seams. This is a sleeveless dress, and I did not have any prepared bias binding for the garment. And so I went back over to the fabric to cut out a 2-inch strip of bias binding for both of the sleeve openings. But first I needed to measure. So I just simply measured all the way around the sleeve opening, and I haven't sewn up my side seams yet. But I've measured all the way around and cut 2 strips that are about 26 inches long, and make sure that they're bias. And so what I'm going to do is simply fold the bias strip in half, pin it to the arm opening, stitch 3/8 of an inch to tack it down. Then I'm going to go back and stitch my side seams closed. I'll come back to the arm opening and flip the bias binding to the wrong side and then top stitch. I've pinned the binding to the arm opening, and I'm over here at the machine, and I'm simply going to stitch a 3/8 inch seam allowance here. And as you can see, I have not sewn my side seams. I'm sort of treating this rayon project, this A-line dress, as I would adding binding to a knit dress, to be honest. And I know it's a little unconventional, but I really, I just find it a lot easier to stitch the binding on when it's not completely in a round circle. And so this is the approach that I have taken. So I'm just going to simply stitch from one side of the side seam to the other, sewing this on, and then I'm going to come back and we're going to do a little bit of understitching to make sure that the binding stays close to the inside of the garment and not the outside of the garment. The binding is now attached to the arm opening, and we have a couple of options here. I want to make sure that we do the understitching on this binding so that the arm opening stays very flat and that it doesn't curl to the binding doesn't curl to the front side of your garment. And so you'll see here that I'm kind of fidgeting a little bit with the binding, making sure that I can do the proper understitching here. If you would like, you can take the garment over to your ironing station and make sure that you're pressing the seam allowance that you just sewed towards the binding itself and away from the garment. I just don't do a lot of excessive pressing when I'm working with rayon. I just try to do as much finger pressing as I can, because when you're working with a batik in general, I mean, I just think that the warmth of your hand and your fingertips is just enough to make sure that we have a flat seam when we're doing our understitching here. So I'm just going to continue to sew along the arm opening on both of the arms until the understitching is done. And then we'll come back and work on our next step. Take a moment here and really take a look at your understitching and make sure that there aren't any gathers or tucks or puckers or anything that are sitting in there that need to be fixed before we sew up our side seams. But before we do that, you'll see next that we want to make sure that we're trimming our seam allowance down. This takes a little bit of time and a little bit of patience. So just really, really patiently take your scissor, whichever you like to use. I just am using my little snippet scissors that are sitting by my sewing machine to cut away the excess seam allowance that will, we want to keep the binding less bulky. And so use whatever technique that you have to remove that little bit of excess seam allowance. Now we're going to pin the side seams together and jump over to the serger and serge our side seams using a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Remember to match your notches that were snipped or cut or marked when you cut out your pattern. Make sure that the tie is inside your seam. Now it's time to serge the side seams. And I have already attached the bias binding to the sleeve opening. And so I'm simply going to use a 5/8 inch seam on the serger to serge from the arm opening down to the hem on both sides. And then we'll finish the sleeve opening by turning the facing towards the wrong side and top stitching using a regular sewing machine. As you start sewing with a serger, because we have so many different layers with the binding and the edge of the seam, it's going right through that serger. And so just go really slow. Make sure that you keep your fingers away from that knife and that you're pulling the pins out before it gets too close to the presser foot. And just get it going really, really slowly. And then once you make your way a little bit into a couple of inches in past the initial binding, everything will go quite easily after that. I did have to use my turn wheel just to work through the first little edge of the seam there. But once I got through that, just remove your pins and you'll be just fine to finish the serge of the entire side seam. The side seam is all stitched, and now it's time to turn the facing towards the back, and then we're going to top stitch. So I come over here to my ironing station and press the facing towards the back, just really gently. And then I'll take it and pin it in place just a couple of places around to secure it and keep it in place before I top stitch the facing in place, finishing it off. And I want to show you also how I finish the side seam where the facing, let me turn this here, where the facing is, here's our side seam, and then we have all this bulk up here. And what I do is I will take and turn our side seam to one side and press it here. And then, without snipping through that very first needle thread, okay, I want to keep that secure, but I'm going to snip across right there, okay, without snipping through that very first needle thread. And then the side seam, we're going to press the opposite direction. And you will see that I'm going to get rid of these threads here. Use fray check to make sure that your threads don't pull out. And then we're going to turn our facing towards the wrong side. And make sure you're not stretching this rayon. It has a tendency to really move on you, and we don't want that to happen. We just want to make sure that the binding is doing its job by stretching around that curve, okay, ever so gently. Press it in place. If you have double-sided tape, sticky tape, this is a really good spot to put just a little bit of that in place to keep that in place before we top stitch. But I use just pins just to keep it in place. Now remember, don't stretch this, just simply let the bias binding do its job and curl around the curve of your arm opening. Because really what I'm doing is not pulling anything, I'm just simply touching it with my fingers. And you may have noticed that when I attached the binding to the edge of the sleeve opening, I did not press my binding in half with wrong sides together. I simply pinned them together with wrong sides together, because the minute you press that binding edge, you see how this is kind of twisting a little bit here, which is not necessarily so great. But if I had pressed that ahead of time, I would have a press line like this, or a crease, and it would look like I didn't have it in the right place, and you would just be fidgeting a lot. So don't put a press in your binding before it's attached and then folded back like this, because you can smooth it out and it will lay beautifully. Just let that bias binding do its job. We'll tack it with a pin or two. And now, your choice, you can either take a needle and thread and hand baste it right along the edge, giving you that line of where you need to top stitch on the right side of the garment, or feel comfortable top stitching a certain amount of inches in from the edge all the way around. So just make sure you've looked at all of your binding to see if it's kind of an equal distant away, and then either baste it or go right over to your sewing machine and top stitch it. I removed the extension table on my sewing machine. I shifted the needle position over to the left just a little bit, a couple of notches, because that way I can follow my presser foot all the way around the sleeve opening to top stitch. And I'm lengthening my stitch just a little bit because it doesn't need to be super tight. It'll just give it a really, really nice finished look. And I'm starting at the underarm area, just a little bit past it. And I'm just going to follow this, removing my pins as I go. Make sure everything looks great and that you caught your binding on the back. And everything looks really, really good. Now, I still have to go back and tack my facing down, but I'll do that later after I put this on. Okay, let's go do the other arm opening. Oh, I really like this. The last step in sewing up this garment is to finish the hem. And I'm actually taking probably a quick approach to finishing the hem of the garment. I am going to serge the edge of the hem and turn it, press it, and top stitch it, giving it just a finished edge. You can finish your hem any way that you would like. I just love to just seal up that rayon thread with a serger stitch. So the other idea is to serge your edge, flip it towards the back, press it, and then turn it one more time and top stitch or hand stitch it in place. However you want your finished edge to look, just use your favorite technique. I do have the knife engaged, and I'm simply going to run it right along the edge, creating a simple, clean edge finish. When I get to the beginning of the serging stitches, I hold the thread, go right up to it to cut it off, and then I lock the knife down, make sure that my threads are going to stitch right into the other threads, and then I'm going to stop, turn it, and stitch right off the edge of the fabric. And I kind of stop beyond any seam so that it doesn't add to the bulk of the seam itself. And then make sure you leave a little bit of a tail, because what we're going to do is make sure that we use fray check on the threads themselves, but we're going to pull this out and tuck it underneath. We'll clip it a little bit too, but we'll tuck it underneath our hem so that you don't see the thread and they're secure inside your hem. So this is the amount of fabric I just kind of cut off by making the bottom of the hem even. If you're not familiar with the hot hemmer, this is a tool by Clover, which is really fantastic. It feels like a very stiff flannel, to be honest, and it's used for ensuring that you are pressing a hem or pressing whatever you're trying to press in the same distance from start to end here, okay? And one thing to know is that we're going to be hemming a curve. So just work with your fabric as you go around the hem of this garment. But I'm using, my goal is to be about 5/8 of an inch to be the hem, and then simply tack it down using your 5/8 as your marker, and move your hot hammer tool as you go to make sure that you're consistently that 5/8 of an inch. If you use a different hem width, that's fine. Now I'm going to take, this is where I excuse me, this is where I serged off the hem of the garment, and so I want to make sure that I snip off any excess threads. And then when I sew this, I'm going to make sure that this is tacked and tucked right underneath that hem. And you can't really even tell that that's where the join is. Use pins if you feel you need to keep this in place, but typically by pressing your hem in place, it'll stay in place when you're working with the rayon. It really does create a nice little crease. So we'll move this over again, over to the next seam, and set this in to get our 5/8. Press, and then just keep moving it along and pressing as you go. Okay. And now what I do is I like to move the fabric over so that I have two different pressing areas. Hopefully I'm within the image up above. And set this in the middle, and then gradually, using your measurement on the guide, make sure that you're staying 5/8 of an inch, or whatever your measurement happens to be. And I do pin right at the seam to make sure that the seam stays right on top of itself, because that really, otherwise it'll continuously get pushed as you top stitch. So feel free here to top stitch with your machine or hand hem your garment. As you can see, I did put a lot more pins in here just to make sure that everything was in place. And I changed the thread. I think it's still going to be a little lighter than I want it to be, but I think it'll be fine. And I measured in from the edge of my presser foot to where I think the stitching will be. So I'm really comfortable with top stitching this using my sewing machine instead of hand stitching it. So I think this will be just perfect. So I'm just going to quickly zip around here and hem the dress. I'm really excited to see how this dress looks. Okay, let's go take a look at what the dress looks like. So let me show a few close-ups of the garment. I just love this dress. The neckline, here, I'll just do this. The neckline really turned out beautiful with a little extra interfacing that we put in there. And sleeveless, it has a really beautiful finish to the arm. And the back has the tie. And you know, the one thing that I didn't mention earlier, I don't think I did anyway, hopefully I'm not being repetitive, but I really tried to position the tie, the fabric for the tie, along the same color change as the lower portion of this dress. I kind of wanted to make sure that if we used the lighter shade from the top of the dress, it wouldn't look like it was just you would be so noticeable to see the tie. And so I really wanted it to blend. And I think I accomplished that goal. I'm really happy with that. And then the darts and everything in the front. But it's just a simple dress that really, I think when you're working with a fabric like a gradation and it has that color change to it, really I think the elegance of it becomes the fabric more than the style of the garment itself, because really all you see is the change in the color of the fabric. So I hope you take an opportunity to try sewing this garment and to enjoy this amazing dress, whether or not you wear it with a shawl, a jacket, or just by itself. I think it's just a gorgeous, gorgeous dress. So we will have these kits available on our website like we do currently for the linen version of the New Look 6340 pattern. So let me know what you think, and hopefully you'll share any comments you might have regarding the dress, any suggestions, anything that I need to dive into a little deeper when it comes to garment construction or fabric information. Just let us know. And until next time, keep sewing, smiling, and sharing.